Today, we're going to use the player icon node that we created last week to make a circle sci-fi button. Let's go. All right, so last week we created this player icon node using a combination of 3 sign distance field nodes. Today, we're going to take this node and combine it with a bunch of the other nodes that we've created in the series to make the circular sci-fi button. And speaking of other nodes, the most valuable thing about this series that we've been going over is not necessarily the UI elements that we've been creating, like the sci-fi button we're going to be creating today, but it's this set of subgraph nodes that we've been building along the way. You can use these to build all kinds of different user interface elements and other 2D effects. These are building blocks or shortcuts that make it faster to achieve the results you want. If you haven't been following along with the series so far, I put links down in the description for each of these nodes so that you can find the ones that you need and quickly jump to the videos where I show you how to make them. So if I add one of these nodes in our graph today, you'll know where to find it. All right, let's get started building our button element. We'll start out in Unity today and then switch over to Unreal and build the same thing there. All right, so here we are in our graph that we're going to be working on. We've got this new subgraph called Sci-Fi Circle Button, and we've already added our player icon. So besides the player icon, there are 4 other UI elements that we're going to create. So we're going to make those today. But first, the first thing that we need to do is scale down our player icon. Right now, it's filling the entire frame, and we want to scale it so it's not quite so large. So let's plug in our scale node here, and we're going to set our scale to 0.4 and 0.4 because we want our player icon to be there, but just kind of in the center of the button instead of filling the whole frame. All right, so speaking of UV coordinates, we need to go ahead and add our standard UV coordinate configuration here. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to open our Blackboard and add a new vector 2 called UV. And we'll select it. And then we'll also open up our graph inspector here. And we'll check this use custom binding box and set the label to UV0. Now that we've got our UV input for our subgraph, we can add our branch on input connection node and hook up our UV input to the input pin there and the connected pin. And then our UV coordinates we can hook up to the not connected pin. All right, so we've got our UV coordinates, and we're just going to plug our UV coordinates directly into the UV socket on our scale node so that our incoming UVs can control the size and placement of our player icon. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next element. This is a circle element, so we're going to add a circle SDF here. And again, for the UVs, we're just going to plug those directly in from our input UVs. We're going to set the size of this circle to 0.81. Then we're going to set the stroke thickness to 0.008 because we want just the thin outline of a circle. So we're going to take our SDF stroke coming out of our circle node and we're going to anti-aliasing it. We're going to anti-alias it with an anti-aliasing node. So I'll take my SDF stroke output here and just plug it into the gradient and then set my cutoff to 0. So now you can see we've got a nice outline of a circle. And then the last thing that we need to do is we want our circle to be inverted. And so I'm going to add a 1 - node here. And now we've got a nice outline of the circle. So that's our second component out of 5. And we can just take these 2 components, the player icon and our nice circle outline, and we can add them together. So I'm going to create an add node here. And now you can see our button is starting to take shape. We've got our player icon there in the middle. with a circle around the outside. So the next element that we're going to create is a circle of circles or a ring of circles. And to do that, again, we need a circle SDF. So I'll go ahead and add that. And for this circle, we're going to set our size to 0.4. And we're going to set, actually, I think that may be all that we need to set, just the size to 0.4. But instead of one circle, we actually want to create a circle of circles. So I need to set up our UV coordinates in order to get that going correctly. So the first thing that we need to do is create a polar coordinates node. And this is going to be what makes our initial circle. So I'll plug our UV coordinates into the polar coordinates node. And we're going to set our radial scale to 0.7 and our length scale to 3. And now I need to take those coordinates that have been rounded and I need to tile them. So I'm going to add a grid tiles node. And this is going to repeat our polar coordinates over and over, which is what allows us to create that circle of circles. So I'm going to set tile U to 1. And I'm going to set tile V to 24. Now you can see I've got UV coordinates going around in a circle and repeated 24 times. So I can take the scaled pattern UV coming out of my grid tiles node here and pass it into the circle. Now you can see I've got a nice circle of circles. So pretty easy to create that effect. And then all I need to do is take the fill coming out of here and add our anti-aliasing. And again, we'll set our cutoff to 0. Actually, in this case, we're going to set our cutoff to 0.5. And now we've got a nice circle of circles that's smoothly anti-aliased. Let's go ahead and clean up our graph here and just minimize these nodes so they don't take up quite as much space, because we have quite a few elements to create here. All right, so there's our circle of circles. The next thing that we're going to do is create a background. And so again, let's create another circle SDF. And we'll connect up our UV coordinates to this circle as well. For the size of this circle, we're going to set that to 0.9. We're going to set the edge max to 0.02. And again, we'll set our stroke thickness to 0.008. And for the background of this element, we just want the SDF coming out of here. So we're actually going to negate the SDF to give us the inverse. And that's going to give us a nice gradient radial fall off like this. Let's go ahead and add a saturate node just to make sure that we don't go outside the 0 to 1 range. And then we're going to raise this to a power. We'll raise it to a power of 2 just to kind of shape the gradient a little bit and add and create these edges here that have a really soft fall off. And now we need to tone it down a little bit because this is a background element. And so I'm just going to add a multiply here, and we're going to multiply it by 0.5. Just to soften it up and tone it down so that this element will recede into the background. All right, so there is our fourth element. Got our nice radial gradient there for our background. And now for our last element, we need to create kind of an animated rotated circle. And to do that, we're going to use the circle segments node. And this node is pretty cool. You can see it's got these segments going around in a circle here. Instead of 18 segments though, in our case, we're just going to use 3. So I'll type a 3 there. And then for the other settings, I can just leave them as they are. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to take the stroke coming out of here and mask it with our circle segments node. So I'm just going to add a subtract. And I'm going to take our stroke coming out of our circle SDF node and subtract it from the wedges of our circle segments node. And what you can see there is we've got our circle stroke coming out, and then we're masking it, we're subtracting this circle segments node so that we get this cool rotating pattern that has these nice little gaps in here. And that's what kind of makes things look a little bit more sci-fi. All right, and then just to smooth things out a little bit, I'm gonna add an anti-aliasing node, and we'll set our cutoff to 0.5. And those are the elements that we need to now piece together our effect. All right, let's start combining things together. So I'm going to combine together the circle segments effect with our multiply that we have here. And I'm going to do that with a maximum node. So I'm going to take a maximum of our circle segments and our background. So now you can see those are combined together. And then I'm going to take the maximum of that effect and combine it together with our circle of circles. So now you can see we've got our background there, we've got our circle of circles, and we've got our outer edge of these notched circles going on. So that looks pretty cool. And then we can just take the final bit here. Again, we can use a maximum node to combine this together with the other effects. And now you can see we've got a black and white version of the entire button. But this is just static, and we actually want to add in some effects that allow us to control the appearance of our button depending on the state that it's in, whether it's hovered over or pressed or selected, that sort of thing. So in order to achieve those effects, again, we need to open up our blackboard here. And we're going to add a couple of Booleans. So I'll add a Boolean that's called selected. I'll add a Boolean that's called pressed. And I'll add a third Boolean that's called active. And these are the controls that we're going to use that will allow the player to interact with the button. You know, when the player mouses over the button, when the player presses the button, and when the button is active or inactive. All right, so let's go ahead and add in these Booleans so that we can create the various states. So the first state that we're going to create is selected. And in order to do this, we're going to come up here to our circle segments node. Right now, our UVs are rotating, and we want to be able to make these rotate or not rotate depending on the state. So I'll bring in the selected state, and we're going to create a branch node based on selection. We're going to either rotate the UVs or not, depending on what state we're in. So I'm going to add a rotate node, and this is going to rotate our UV coordinates. So when selected is true, our UV coordinates are going to rotate. By the way, I need to bring in our UVs here. We'll connect that to rotate, and we're also connected to false. So when selected is false, we're just going to use our UVs from down here. But when it's true, we're going to select our rotated UVs, and we'll rotate our UVs using linear time. And we're going to set the speed of linear time to 0.1. And then we're going to take that loop and we're going to multiply it by 360 degrees. And then we'll pass this rotation value into rotation here. And we need to make sure that we set our rotation to degrees. All right, so now our rotation is animated, and we can plug our UVs in here. And for our rotation down here, we have linear time coming in, but we actually want to set that to 0. So I'm just going to create a float value that's set to 0 and plug that in just like that. So now you can see that our rotation has stopped, but we can control that based on our selected node. So if I set our selected to true, now you can see we're getting rotation. So when I'm moused over this, or when it's selected, we're going to be rotating. But when it's not selected, it's going to be static. All right, there's one other thing that I want to do with selected, and that is I want to hide some of the elements depending on if it's selected or not. So we're going to take this anti-aliasing node here in our maximum, and we're going to add in another branch node. And I'm going to bring in my selected as the branch predicate here. And for our anti-aliasing node, we're going to wire that into false. And for our maximum node, we're going to wire that into true. So when selected is true, we're going to show the entire UI element. But when it's false, we're going to show it without the background added in. So let's just go ahead and wire this into our maximum here. Now you can see when our node is not selected, there's no background. But if we select our selected input here and turn it to true, now there is a background and the outer circle is animating. So there's not selected and there's selected. Cool, so we've set up our selected state. The next state that we're going to set up is our pressed state. Now, in order to make pressed work correctly, we need to add another parameter in here, and this is our button color. So I'm just going to name this button color. And for our default button color, we're just going to use this kind of electric blue color. So we'll bring in button color, and I'm just going to take the result of this maximum node here, and I'm going to multiply it by the button color. So now we have a nice blue effect here. So these parts of the button are going to be blue, but we also have some parts of the button down here that we want to be white. And so what I'm going to do is add a lerp node, and we're going to blend between the blue elements of the button and the white elements of the button. But here's where the pressed comes in. So I'm going to bring in our pressed state, or our pressed boolean here, and we're going to add a new branch, and I'll plug the pressed into the predicate of the branch. And when pressed is true, I'm going to set this value to be 0. But when it's false, we're going to connect up the combination of our player icon and this outline circle here. So I'll bring this in and connect that to false, and we'll set that to be the B value of our lerp. And then to lerp between these two values, I'll come down here to my player icon and my circle, and I'll go ahead and connect that up. So now you can see we've got the blue elements and the white elements combined together. And when we set pressed, you can see that these values are going black, so that when the button is pressed, the white elements invert and turn black instead. So it looks like the player is pressing down on that button. All right, the last thing that we need to do is set up our active state. And so I'll bring in our active boolean here, and we'll create a branch. And we're going to set active to be the branch's predicate. And we're going to set this lerp to be the true value. And for our false value, we're going to take this maximum, and we're just going to multiply it by 0.5 so that it's not quite as bright. It's going to be like a gray value here. You can see there's our maximum, and then we just tone it down with 0.5 and pass that into our false value. So when our active state is false, we'll get a grayscale toned down version of the button. But when our active state is true, we'll get a nice colorized, brighter version of the button. All right, and that's our final result. So now that we've built everything, we can plug it into the output. So I'll just grab the output here, and for our out, this is going to be called our color, and we're going to set this to be a vector 3. And then we need to add one more output here, and this is going to be our alpha, so our transparency. And obviously we'll set that to a float. And we're just going to take this maximum node where we combined all of our black and white elements, and we'll pass that out as the alpha channel. All right, so there we go. Our button is completed. We've got our nice player icon. We've created a circle element, a circle of circles, a nice radial gradient background, and a really cool animated circle segments element. And we've combined all these together with our pressed, active, and selected states so that the player can control the states based on if they're hovering over, if they're pressing, that sort of thing. So we've got all these states set up and we're all set. So we'll save our sci-fi button and just add a couple of more touches here. We'll come here to our subgraphs path element and set this to procedural/samples so we can find it. And we'll also set the graph settings preview to be preview 2D so that we get a nice two-dimensional preview on our subgraph. And that's it. It's time for us to switch over to Unreal, and we'll create the same button there as well. All right, here we are in Unreal, and you can see we've created a material function called Circle Sci-Fi Button, and we've added our player icon material function to it, and we've wired that out as our result so that you can see what our player icon looks like here. Now, we need to do a couple of things. We need to create 5 elements, and this player icon is one of them. But this isn't quite what we want yet because right now the player icon's filling the whole screen. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to add our UV scale node. We'll connect this up to the UVs of our player icon. And we actually want to set the scale to 0.4 and 0.4. Because we want this player icon to be featured in the center of the button. We don't want it to fill the whole frame like it was before. Now, speaking of UV coordinates, we need to bring in the default UV coordinates from outside the material function. So I'm just going to add a material input here, or a function input. And we're going to call this UV. And we're going to set it to vector 2. And for the default, we're just going to add the texture coordinates here and plug that into the preview. And then for the input here, we need to make sure that we check this use preview value as default. So these are our default UV coordinates, and we can just go ahead and plug those into scale. And our first element of our sci-fi button is complete. So we've got our player icon here. The next element that we want to create is the circle outline that goes around the player icon. And for that, we need the circle SDF node. And we're going to take the output of the stroke here, and we want it to be anti-alias. So we're going to add our anti-aliasing node. And I believe that we need to set our cutoff to be 0. So I'm just going to wire a 0 into our cutoff there. And then I'm going to add a 1- node here so that we can see the result of our element. So yeah, there you can see we've got our nice circle outline. But there are a couple of things we need to set here. We need to set our size to 0.81. We'll wire that in so our circle's a little bit bigger. And we need to set our stroke thickness. You can see right now our circle is pretty thick. And we actually want it to be quite a bit thinner. So I'm going to set this to a value of 0.008. And we'll connect that up to our stroke thickness. So now we've got a nice thin ring. And we've got our player icon here. And we can take these two elements and combine them together. And the way that we're going to combine them is just with an add node. So I'll take an add node and add our ring and our player icon. Now you can see we've got our nice player icon there combined together with our ring. If we wire that out, we'll be able to see it over here on our preview. That's looking great. There is one thing that I forgot though. We need to take our UV coordinates here and wire that into our circle as well. Basically all the elements we're creating, we're going to be connecting up to our UVs so that if we want to use this material function and put this button somewhere else on the on the layout or something like that, you can pass in your own UV coordinates and it'll control all of the 5 elements of the button that we're going to be creating today. All right, so we've got our first 2 elements there. The next element that we're going to make is a circle of circles. And so obviously we're going to need a circle SDF node. So there it is. And we want to take our circle and tile it a bunch. And so in order to do that, we're going to create a grid tiles node. Before we connect these things up though, let me just make sure that I've got the settings set correctly for this circle. For our size, we want the circle to be 0.4. And I think all the rest of the settings are good just the way they are. All right, let's go ahead and hook up our grid tile. We're going to take this scaled pattern UV and hook that up to our circle. And if we start previewing this node, it'll just show you what we're doing with our progress so far. So you can see we've got this nice grid of circles, but we want to change our grid a little bit. Instead of a grid like this, well, let's go ahead and just hook up for our UV tile U. We're going to set that to 1. And then for our tile V, we're going to set that to 24. So now you're going to see a nice line of small circles going vertically. But what we actually want to do is wrap these around in a circle. And so in order to do that, I need the polar coordinates node that we created previously. So we can pass this in. Now you can see we've got a nice circle of circles. But we need to adjust our polar coordinates just a little bit. I'm going to set our radial scale to 0.7. And what we're trying to do is basically make it so our circles don't look quite so stretched. So I'll set our radial scale to 0.7, and we're going to set our length scale to 3. And now what you'll see is we've got our nice circles. Now they're not stretched anymore, they're nice and round. All right, so that's that that's that element. Now we need to take our UVs and plug them into our polar coordinates here. Then we'll just kind of clean things up a little bit to kind of group the nodes of this element together. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our third element. We've got our player icon, we've got our outline circle, and we've got our nice circle of circles. The next thing that we need is kind of a radial gradient, a soft radial gradient for our background. So we're going to add one more circle SDF, and we'll hook up our UV coordinates to it. And for our background outline, we're going to be using the SDF coming out of here. I'm going to multiply this by -1 to invert the result. Let's just preview this. There you go. We got a nice radial gradient. We do need to adjust our circle here just a little bit. So I'm going to add a size value, and I'm going to multiply this by 0.9. So we can wire this into size, and that's going to fill our frame with the background. And now we can take the results of our multiply, and we're going to add a saturate. And then we're going to raise it to a power. And the reason that we're doing this is we just want to make it just a little bit softer. So I'm going to raise it to a power of 2, and then multiply by a value of 0.5, just to tone it down a little bit, because it's supposed to be a background element. So now we can see that we've got a little bit softer radial gradient with a nice smooth fall off. All right, that is our fourth element. So we just need to create one more. So let's move these things kind of down here. And for this last element, we want to create a ring around the outside of our button that has a couple of segments. So in order to create this segmented ring, we're going to use the circle segments node that we created previously. And we're going to take the stroke coming out of our circle. Actually, let me just preview this, because this node is pretty cool looking. Hopefully I don't give anybody seizures with this crazy one. Let's tone this down a little bit, because right now it looks kind of like a crazy circus act. Right now, we're just going to set our segments to a value of 3, just to tone this down a little bit. And we're going to set our spacing to a value of 0.8. And we're going to use this as a mask to create some segments in the circle that we've created here. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to take this stroke coming out of our circle, and we're going to subtract this circle segment thing here. So we'll add a subtract, and we're going to take our stroke coming out of here, and we're going to subtract our circle segment mask. So now if we preview this, what you'll see is we've got this nice outline here, and it's got these little segments cut out of it. And this is a pretty cool looking effect, but I think it's a little bit too thick again. So we need to set up our stroke thickness. I'm just going to add another hard-coded parameter here. And this is going to be a thickness, again, of 0.008. We'll wire that into stroke thickness. And now you can see we've got this nice stroke outline with these segments missing. And we're able to set these segments to be missing with this cool circle segments node. All right, just a couple of final touches here. We can come over here and add another anti-aliasing node. And in this case, we're going to set the cutoff to be 0.05. Just to kind of smooth out or harden up our line there. And now let's kind of combine some of these things together. So we're going to take the result coming out of our anti-aliasing node, and we're going to add a maximum. And we'll use our maximum to combine together our background and our rotating circle there. So now we've got our nice gradient background and our outline. And then again, we can create another maximum to combine this together with our circle of circles down here. So we'll create another maximum node. And actually, it looks like I wanted to add another anti-aliasing right here. So I'm going to add our anti-aliasing node and set our cutoff to 0.5. And now we can find the max of that and our circle elements up there. So now we've combined our circle of circles, our segmented circle outline, and our nice background. And now the only thing that remains is to add our element from down here. So again, we'll add our maximum, and we'll bring in our player icon and our circle outline, and we'll preview the whole thing. And yeah, now you can see we've got a nice representation of the black and white version of our sci-fi button. It's looking pretty cool. So now we just need to finish it off. And there are just a couple of things that we need to do to finish it. First, let's add some color. So we need to add an input parameter, or a function input rather. And we're going to set this to be a vector 3, and we'll call it button color. And let's just set the preview of the button to be kind of like an electric blue. Let's see if I can get a nice electric blue color going here. I think I can get what I want if I set this to blue to 1 and then green to 0.25. Yeah, that looks pretty nice. And some of the elements I want to be colorized, and some I want to leave white. So let's go ahead and set that up. The way that we're going to do it is, so these are my blue elements here, and I can just take my button color and multiply that together with the elements that I want to be blue. And there we go. So we've got this nice ring element blue, and then the background elements is blue, but we still have the white ring and the player icon as white. So that's looking pretty nice. All right, so we've colorized things. Let's go ahead and set up our button states. The first state that we're going to set up is the selected state, when the button is selected, we want things to be animated, including this outer ring going around. So I'm going to create another input, and we're going to call this selected. And we're going to set it to be an input Boolean. And we're going to add a static switch here. So the value of the static switch is going to be our selected Boolean. And when the Boolean is true, we're going to want to do some rotation. So I'm going to bring in the rotator node, and we'll connect that up to true. And we want to rotate our coordinates. So we'll bring our UV coordinates here and connect that up to our rotator. And when it's false, we're going to connect it up to just the coordinates as they are. And so these UV coordinates we're going to pass into our circle segments. Let's just go ahead and see what happens here. And here we get an error, missing preview connection for function input selected. So this guy, I forgot to check this all important box, use preview values default. So we'll check that, and we're going to set it so our preview value is 1. And I think I also, for a Boolean node here, I actually have to create a Boolean and connect it up. Okay, looks like I've done some things wrong here. We need to create a static Boolean here, and we need to connect it to our input selected, but this one, instead of being an input Boolean, needs to be a function input static Boolean. There we go. Okay, so we've got our static Boolean here. When it's false, oh, let's see, we also need to come over here to our circle segments and set our rotation here to be 0. So I'm going to create another constant value, set our rotation there to be 0. So now, when our input selected is false, we get no rotation, but then when it's true, we get a nice rotation. And I think we want that rotation to be just a little bit faster. And so the way that I'm going to do that is with a linear time node, and we're going to connect up linear time to our rotator here. And now we can connect something up to our speed node there. So if we set our speed, obviously if we set our speed to be 0, we'll get no rotation. If we set it to be 1, we'll get something that's just a little bit faster. And you can see how it's jumping here. And to fix that jumping, what I need to do is add a multiply here, and I need to multiply this value by 360. And the reason for that is because the value coming out of here is between 0 and 1, but the rotator node expects degrees. So the time value there is in degrees. So if I just wire this in, now I've got my time value in 360 degrees. And now I just need to tone it down a little bit by setting my speed to something like 0.01. So now you can see I've got a nice circle loop going on, and I don't have that hitching that I had before. All right, so we've got our outline going on here, and when our selected is true, our outline is animated, but if I set it to false, it stops. So I can turn it on and turn it off with our input selected node there. Okay, so when the button is selected, our outline is animated. Now there is one other thing that we want to do with our selected state. And so I'm going to come over here to where we've got our anti-aliasing node and our max node. And I'm going to add another branch here, or another switch. And we're going to take the output of our max node here and pass that into true. And we're going to take the output of our anti-aliasing node and pass that into false. And then I'm going to take our input selected here and also pass that into our value. All right, so now we've got our switch and we can pass this into our maximum node here. And let's just take a look at what that's going to do. So when we turn on our Boolean here, when we turn it off rather, now you can see that our background has disappeared. So when our node is selected, we're going to animate it and turn on the background. But when it's not selected, we're going to stop it and turn off the background. So this is what an unselected node looks like. And then when you mouse over it, it looks like that. Okay, pretty cool. Next, let's make the state of the button when it's pressed. And in order to do that, what we want to do is take these elements that are normally white and turn them black. So when you click on the button, the player icon and the white ring here are going to turn black. So in order to do that, we'll take the output here coming out of our player icon and our white ring. And I'm going to add a new function input here. And we'll make this one a static Boolean as well. We'll add in a default static Boolean. And we'll set it to false. So when the button is pressed, when the button is not pressed, we're going to have the player icon and the ring be white. All right, and so in order to do that, we need to add a switch again. And we'll set this as the value. And so when the value is true, we're going to set it to be black. And when the value is false, we're going to set it to be the output of our player icon and our ring. So basically, those are going to be black when it's true, and they're going to be white when it's false. So now we're going to take our button color right here, and we're going to add a lerp node. And we're going to blend between our button color there and the result of these nodes down here. And we'll use the output coming from down here as the alpha of our lerp. So let's go ahead and preview our lerp now. So you can see what's going on. We've got our nice blue elements and we've got our white elements. And then when we change this static bool, when the button is pressed, now you can see that our elements have turned black. Oh, and I forgot to name this input. So let's name our Boolean here pressed. Okay, there's just a couple more things that we need to do. We need to add one more function input, and this is active. So when our button is active, it's going to be nice and colorized. But when it's inactive, we're going to desaturate it so that it's just grayscale. So let's choose static Boolean here. And we'll set up a default for this one. And we're going to name this one active. So when our button is active, we're going to add a switch. And this is going to be, or whoops, we're going to add a static switch. And when our button is active, it's going to look like that. But when it's false, we want to take the maximum that we've created here. Let's see. I think I need to detangle some things here. Actually, I'm going to take this maximum and we're going to multiply it by 0.5 just to tone it down a little bit, make it kind of like a grayscale version of itself. All right, let's go ahead and preview this switch. And so now when our button is active, it looks like this. And then when it's inactive, it looks like that. All right, perfect. And that is what we're going to output as our result. But instead of result, we're going to call this color. And we need one more output. So we're going to create another function output. And this maximum node here that we've set up is going to be our alpha channel. So here our second output is going to be our alpha, and we'll pass out that value as our alpha channel. Great. So now we've got our output color and we've got our output alpha. Let's go ahead and preview our output color and just do a couple of more tests to check to see what happens with our inputs here. So when the button is inactive, it goes grayscale. When the button is pressed, the white elements turn black. And when the button is hovered over, it looks like this, but when it's not hovered over, it's going to look like this. So it's stationary without a background until you hover over it, and then it does that. All right, that's pretty cool. So we've created our sci-fi button with the player icon that we made last week as the input, and then a bunch of different Boolean parameters to allow us to control the button states. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope this was helpful as we continue to talk about creating UI elements. All right, everybody, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.